Well, for more on climate displacement, I spoke to Alex Randall, Program Manager at the Climate Change and Migration Coalition. I began by asking him about the parts of the world that are the most affected.
Initially, at any rate, most of that migration and displacement that's caused by extreme weather events, caused by the things that are going to be made worse by climate change, is actually going to be internal. So I think it's really going to be people moving within their own country. So the important question is, firstly, which countries are those and which regions? And I think the places that we need to look at are the Pacific, obviously, with low-lying island states, the Ganges Delta around Bangladesh and India, and the Horn of Africa countries. I think those are what we might call the hotspots, where over the coming decades, we're certainly going to see a lot more of human movement, a lot more people migrating, and a lot more people being displaced by sudden disasters that are going to become worse as the planet warms due to climate change.
And let's look at some of these climate migration numbers. We saw that 157 million people were displaced by climate-related disasters in the last 7 years, nearly 15 million just last year. So what are governments doing to prepare for this phenomenon?
We can say really that the kind of preparations that need to be made fall into several different kinds of categories. And one of the really important ones is about rights, is about human rights. And it's to do with the right for people to move, and if they do have to move, to have their human rights respected in wherever it is that they go to, and not to be forced to be sent back to somewhere that is dangerous. So that's something that governments at the moment often fail at, unfortunately. So that's something certainly that there needs to be a lot of international pressure on countries that are likely to experience this kind of displacement to make sure that those rights are respected. The second issue, I think, is really about emergency planning, and it's really asking those kind of questions. What are countries doing in preparation for these new kinds of disasters? What are countries doing in order to make sure that they are more able and more ready to cope? Now, we can't simply just put all of the responsibility onto the countries that are going to be facing those disasters, because really, at the end of the day, climate change, the warming of the planet, has not been caused by the emissions of those countries who tend to be some of the poorest countries in the world. So the question for developed country governments really is, what are those developed country governments doing in order to help finance that kind of resilience building in the countries that are most vulnerable?
So we have US President Donald Trump, who is considered a climate skeptic and wants to pull the US out of the climate accord. And then you also have China still taking this leadership role when it comes to curbing emissions. But as you mentioned, it does require funding and international cooperation. So what will it really take then to make a meaningful impact in tackling this issue?
I think really the key thing to remember here is that you can pay now or you can pay later. And the economic impact of not dealing with climate change is really going to come back to bite us later, when we discover that, in fact, by failing to curb our emissions, we have in fact, or will have in fact, made the whole situation much, much worse and much more expensive. Now, that's just one element of climate finance. I think the thing that we're really concerned about is, how is finance being distributed? How is finance and funding being created to help countries cope with displacement, help countries cope with people being forced from their homes by the impacts of climate change? And I think really what that comes down to at the end of the day is this kind of ethical question. And it comes down to the fact that it's the countries that are facing these great kind of episodes of displacement that you mentioned at the beginning, these huge numbers of people being forced from their homes, that have really done the least to cause climate change in the first place. They're the countries that have emitted the least amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The responsibility for the fact that the planet is warming is not with them. So the key question for us is, of course, how much money is needed, but really the question is, like, who should be paying that? Where should that money be coming from? And our feeling really is that finance, that money, has to come from the countries that have essentially got rich, have benefited through decades of high-emitting activities. The burden now really is on them to assist the less developed countries, the countries that are most vulnerable, in coping with the displacement that they're likely to face in the future.